Hi, everyone. Danilo invited me today to talk about the Narkomfin building in Moscow, designed by Moise Ginsburg and Ignati Milinis and constructed in 1930. The Narkomfin is the culminating achievement of constructivist architecture in the former Soviet Union in the USSR. It was designed as housing for workers of the Commissariat for Finance of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or the RSFSR, which was part of the Ministry of Finance of the USSR. The Commissariat for Finance of the RSFSR was called the Narkomfin. So this is the Narkomfin building, but we call it the Narkomfin. Today, I want to talk about the Narkomfin not only in the context of constructivism, but also in the context of formalism, which was a prominent literary and linguistic movement within the late Tsarist Russian Empire and early Soviet Union that developed in the 19-teens and 1920s around the same time as constructivism. My research on this topic analyzes the formalist aspects of the building's design. And the structure of the talk today will be to review key concepts in formalism and constructivism, and to then analyze the Narkomfin as a synthesis of both methods. The image you see here is of the east elevation of the Narkomfin's residential block that was taken after the building was restored in 2020, just before the pandemic. I want to start by discussing the founder of the formalist school or tradition, Viktor Shklovsky. In 1917, Shklovsky published his most famous essay titled Art as Technique, which fellow formalist Boris Eichenbaum declared a manifesto of the formalist method. In Art as Technique, Shklovsky rejects the maxim of the late 19th century linguist Alexander Potebnya that art is thinking in images, a maxim that epitomized the symbolist movement in literature and art during the beginning of the 20th century. Shklovsky instead believed that, quote, the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. To do so, art removes objects from what he called the autonomism of perception. The goal of this estrangement or defamiliarization, or ostranenie in Russian, is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged, end quote. Shklovsky characterized the autonomism of perception as a process of algebrization that permits the greatest economy of perceptive effort. So in other words, objects become signs or symbols, like mathematical symbols, through their over-automatization. Aesthetic feeling, as Shklovsky writes, is the reaction to this economy of perceptive effort, and therefore, perception must be prolonged. Through ostranenie, we regain a sense of immediacy with an object that allows us to experience that object in a new way. And I know that Danilo likes to use Shklovsky's metaphor of turning a log in a fire when the flame starts to diminish. So you turn the log over to rebuild the fire and to feel its warmth and presence again. Another key formalist was Roman Jakobson, who was one of the founders of the Moscow Linguistic Circle while a student at the Lomonosov Moscow State University in the late 19-teens. The Moscow Linguistic Circle was one of the two formalist groups, along with the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, or Opoyaz, in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, that Shklovsky founded. Jakobson became more influential in the West than any other formalist. In 1920, he left Moscow for Prague to pursue his doctorate at Charles University. And there, together with other Russian emigres, Jakobson founded the Prague Linguistic Circle, which applied formalist concepts to the field of structural linguistics that was developed by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure in the early 20th century. And being of Jewish background, Jakobson fled Europe for the United States in the early 1940s to escape Nazism and ended up teaching at Harvard in the next decades. So what I'll do now is give a theoretical explanation of the concepts that Jakobson was working with that are relevant for this discussion. In Saussurean structural linguistics, a sign, for example, a word, is composed as a dyadic relationship between signifier and signified, in which a signifier, so the sound or spelling of a word, is motivated toward its signified content, so the general concept that the word represents or what it means. This relationship, according to de Saussure, is arbitrary. For example, the sound or spelling of the word tree, and this is the example that de Saussure uses in his 1916 book, Course on General Linguistics, has no physical relationship to the most common agreed upon meaning of that signifier. To receive the image of a tree in our minds, and each person within a given community of speakers has a slightly different concept or different image of a tree. We just need to know the sign for that general concept. And we each have the same general concept of that sign because of the consistency between how that signifier is used or deployed and the general concept that we as speakers of the same language tacitly, collectively agree is its signified content. So the deployment of a sign following its most common agreed upon meaning renders, in Shklovsky's terms, the autonomism of perception, which Ostranini attempts to break out of. A well-known example of what we might look back on now and call Ostranini is Marcel Duchamp's Fountain from 1917, the same year that Shklovsky published Artist Technique. Duchamp famously placed a urinal on a pedestal in the first exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York City. And in doing so, estranged the object from its most common agreed upon use or meaning and allowed it to be experienced in a new way. So we might experience the shape or the curvature or surface of the urinal in a new way. And the formalist idea is that a good poet or a good artist will be able to take a sign, which is seemingly fixed in its meanings, and to deconstruct it and isolate the object, in which aesthetic experience with that object fails to refer to the sign from which that object or from which certain qualities of that object have been separated. Jakobson identified 6 functions of language: the emotive, referential, poetic, phatic, metalingual, and conative. I won't go over all these, but I just want to point out the one which, according to Jakobson, is central to communication, that is central to the transmission of a message between an addresser and an addressee, namely the poetic function. In his essay, Linguistics and Poetics from 1960, Jakobson writes that, quote, the set Einstellung, or attitude, toward the message as such, focus on the message, is the poetic function of language. This function, by promoting the palpability of signs, deepens the fundamental dichotomy of signs and objects, end quote. The poetic function draws attention to the message itself, and crucially, not only to what is communicated, but how something is communicated. The how of communication, or again, in Shklovsky's terms, the technique, has a determining effect on signification, on what the signifier is motivated toward. The formalists, particularly those associated with Opoyaz, Shklovsky's group, were interested in analyzing literary technique. And they argued that the more that a sign refers to itself, the more artful or poetic the deployment of that sign is. Now, formalism, when applied to semiotics, which was Jakobsen's and the Prague School's achievement, furthermore claims that without technique, without a how, there is no what, if that makes sense. So the most common agreed upon meaning of a sign, such as the word tree, is not its universal meaning, but rather depends on its most common agreed upon usage, or most common usage or technique of deployment. Architect Peter Eisenman recapitulates this argument in his essay, There Are No Corners After Derrida from 2009. But he borrows from post-structuralist theory and describes the rhetorical impinge on the grammatical or pure rhetoric as opposed to pure grammar, in which the deployment of a signifier engenders not a universal meaning as a decodage of that signifier, but another sign, which is then interpreted using other signs, and so on and so forth. He writes that pure rhetoric denies, quote, pure grammar, which suggests the possibility of an unproblematic dyadic meaning, and pure logic, which in turn postulates the possibility of the universal truth of meanings, end quote. So there is no reference that leads to non-reference. Pure rhetoric guarantees the infinite deferral of the universal truth of meanings, a condition that philosopher Jacques Derrida referred to as différance. So the buck of signification, in other words, never stops. And Eisenman quotes from literary theorist Paul de Man, who in his essay Semiology and Rhetoric from 1973 writes that, quote, only if the sign engendered meaning in the same way that the object engendered the sign, there would be no need to distinguish between grammar and rhetoric, end quote. According to de Man, the effect of the perceived presence of meaning is only possible through what he calls a grammatization of rhetoric, in which the automatization of the technique of the deployment of a signifier gives the illusion of a decodage of that signifier as establishing a pure, non-referential presence of meaning, the illusion of a grammatical condition. And what I'll argue when we get to the Narkomfin is that through Ostranini, the technique of the rhetorical deployment of one of the building elements that I want us to look at today as an architectural sign establishes the illusion of a grammatical condition at the level of aesthetic experience in a way that has a determining effect on the broader social semantics of the project. And just to expand on this idea of Ostranini, I also want to reference a 1987 essay by the art theorist and critic Rosalind Krauss entitled Death of a Hermeneutic Phantom, Materialization of the Sign, and the work of Peter Eisenman, where in writing about Eisenman's early house designs from the 1960s and 1970s, Krauss infers the ethical necessity of increasing the difficulty and length of perception, what she described as the damming up or thickening of aesthetic experience. She writes that, quote, art could force a coming into consciousness through what Shklovsky termed defamiliarization or making strange. It was its capacity to do so that rendered the work of art a cognitive object, one that had the power to cause in its reader or viewer reflection upon the modes of consciousness, end quote. Now, the title of Krauss's essay, Death of a Hermeneutic Phantom, suggests the death of, or metaphorically, the death of transcendental meaning as existing outside of the objective conditions of a given artwork or of a given sign. So again, what Ostranini attempts to do is to separate the object from the sign, and by extension, the meaning attached to that sign in order to bear the object itself. And this is what Jakobsen means when he refers to the poetic function of language that promotes the palpability of signs, deepening the fundamental dichotomy of signs and objects. So it deepens the fundamental dichotomy of the word as a sign and the word as an object. In her essay, Krauss references a passage from Art as Technique in which Shklovsky discusses a diary entry of the Russian realist author Leo Tolstoy, in which Tolstoy reflects on routine activities and the autonomism of perception. He writes, quote, "I was cleaning a room and meandering about, approached the divan and couldn't remember whether or not I had dusted it. Since these movements are habitual and unconscious, I could not remember and felt that it was impossible to remember. So that if I had dusted it and forgot, that is, had acted unconsciously, then it was the same as if I had not. If some conscious person had been watching, then the fact could be established. If, however, no one was looking on unconsciously, uh, uh, looking on unconsciously, if the whole complex of lives of many people go on unconsciously, then such lives are as if they had never been," end quote. So the damming up or thickening of aesthetic experience allows a viewer to recover, as Shklovsky writes in Artist Technique, the sensation of life, the sensation of our own lives being truly lived, rather than forgotten as if they had never been. I now want to shift to constructivism, which paralleled formalism's developments in art and architecture. Constructivism is typically traced back to the polymath artist Vladimir Tatlin, who produced sculptural assemblages in the mid-19 teens that he called counterreliefs. A year before Shklovsky wrote Artist Technique, Tatlin exhibited his most famous corner counterrelief at the last Futurist exhibition of paintings, 010, commonly referred to as the 010 exhibition, which was held at the Dobychina Art Bureau in Petrograd from December 1915 to January 1916. Kazimir Malevich presented his suprematist paintings at the exhibition, including the Black Square, and the exhibition featured mostly suprematist and Cubo-futurist artists, apart from Tatlin, the one constructivist, though at this point there wasn't yet a theory of constructivism. But in corner counterrelief, Tatlin assembled industrial objects such as bent metal panes, wire, and fastenings between adjoining wall surfaces in the corner of the exhibition space. And here we see a reconstruction of the work. But the idea is that there is no hermeneutic phantom in corner counterrelief, no transcendental meaning existing outside of the objective conditions of the work that the rhetorical deployment of the materials attempts to birth, so to speak. There's simply the aesthetic presentation of the materials themselves and the space in which they exist. And the sculpture is a counter-relief because it projects the corner of the gallery space into relief. It draws attention to the corner. And I'll go over some constructivist theory in the next slide, but I first want to share what Shklovsky had to say about Tatlin's counterreliefs. In his 1920 essay regarding texture and counterreliefs, Shklovsky praised Tatlin's work for their textural qualities, a dimension of art that he believed was crucial in prolonging aesthetic experience. Shklovsky wrote that, quote, "The entire work of the artist poet and the artist painter consists first and foremost in creating a continuous palpable thing, a textured thing." And again, recall Jakobson's quote about promoting the palpability of signs, deepening the fundamental dichotomy of signs and objects, that is, separating the object from the sign. Shklovsky reviewed Tatlin as having left painting and pictures in order to move into contrasting one object taken just as it is to another, end quote. So in his counterreliefs, Tatlin maintains the autonomy of each object, contrasting one taken just as it is to another. And in doing so, he reveals the technique of having constructed the work. So by combining the objects into an unfamiliar arrangement, rather than, for example, a figurative or symbolic composition whereby we would recognize a hermeneutic phantom, Tatlin thickened aesthetic experience with the objects. As Shklovsky contended, this thickening would lead to the creation of a new world of palpability, the transference or dissemination of the methods by which to construct artistic things of daily life. And what Shklovsky recognized in Tatlin's work was the possibility to extract art from its coded symbolic domain against Potebnia's maxim about thinking in images. So the artist would construct things of daily life rather than, as Shklovsky described, a series of hints, a series of algebraic signs, as a collection of things having volume but no substance, texture. Recall Shklovsky's quote from Artist Technique about the autonomism of perception as a process of algebrization that permits the greatest economy of perceptive effort. And keep all this in mind when you watch, if you haven't already, Dziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera from 1929. The film shows a day in the life of people in Moscow, Kiev, and Odessa, and rather being actors that perform character types or tropes that serve the purpose of a story, the film shows real people in everyday situations. So similarly to the utilitarian objects in Tatlin's counter reliefs that are placed in a new setting, the people in Vertov's film are captured in a new medium, or life itself is captured in a new medium. And this was still a time when documentary or non-fictional filmmaking was a nascent genre. And in this sense, we can understand Tatlin's counter reliefs as a kind of non-fictional art. In 1922, artist and theorist Alexei Gan published his book Constructivism, in which he accumulated the discussions that had taken place in the Institute for Artistic Culture in Moscow, or the INKUK, between members of the first working group of constructivists. And this group included such artists as Alexander Rodchenko, Varvara Stepanova, and the Stenberg brothers, Vladimir and Georgi, who designed the posters for Dziga Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera. These members voted out the abstract expressionist painter Vasily Kandinsky as the head of the institute, who in 1921 left Russia for Germany to teach at the Bauhaus. Tatlin was not officially a member of the INKUK or belonged to the first working group of constructivists, but he was in Moscow at the time teaching at the Futemas, or the Higher Art and Technical Workshops, which was the leading avant-garde design school in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. The following year, after Gan's book was published, Tatlin left Moscow to open the Petrograd Institute of Artistic Culture, or the Ginkuk, before returning to Moscow in 1926 to teach at the Futin, which was the restructured Futemas. And on the back cover of the translation of Gan's book that we see here on the right, written in Russian, are the words tektonika, faktura, and konstrukcja, or tectonics, texture, and construction. In his book, Gan outlines those three ideas as constructivism's main, what he called disciplines. Tectonics refers to the principle behind which Gan called the new content and the new form. Following the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, the new content and the new form was communism. According to Gan, the educated Marxist, or for the educated Marxist, tectonics is the guiding star, the brain of experimental and practical activity. So constructivism as a conscious artistic tendency emerged from the Bolshevik Revolution, as opposed to suprematism, which preceded the revolution and whose theoretical program had already been developed for the 010 exhibition. And Malevich distributed his suprematist manifesto from Cubism and Futurism to Suprematism, the new painterly realism, during the exhibition. So in this sense, Tatlin's counter-reliefs are proto-constructivist, perhaps more formalist, as I was trying to show, as they lacked what Gan described as the constructivist tectonic. The second discipline of constructivism, texture, refers to the materials that embody the new content and the new form. The third discipline, construction, refers to how those materials are put together. As Gan writes, quote, if the tectonic unites the ideological and formal, and as a result gives a unity of conception, and the factura, or texture, is the condition of the material, then the construction discovers the actual process of putting together, end quote. And again, the reason why I say that Tatlin's counter-reliefs are proto-constructivist, at least in the sense of Gan, is because they express the texture of the materials and reveal the constructive process by which those materials are combined. However, the compositions are not yet guided toward the new content and the new form. Okay, so hopefully that gives us a good sense of constructivism. Formalism and constructivism might seem antithetical, as the former is aesthetically oriented, advocating that the purpose of art is to prolong aesthetic experience, while the latter sought to abolish the autonomy of aesthetics. But we'll see in or how they complement one another in the Narkomfin. I first want to give some background on Moise Ginsburg and his ideas about constructivism and architecture before moving to the Narkomfin. So we just heard about Gan, who developed constructivism's theoretical program, and Ginsburg would refine those ideas within an architectural discourse to advocate for something closer to what we would understand as functionalism. So Ginsburg was born in Minsk, the capital of present-day Belarus. He studied architecture at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Milano, as well as at the Polytechnic Institute in Riga, the capital of present-day Latvia. He moved to Moscow in 1921 and began teaching at the Fultamas. In 1925, he founded the Constructivist Society of Contemporary Architects, or the OSA group, together with Alexander Vesnin, and the group existed until 1930. In 1924, Ginsburg published his most well-known book, Style and Epoch, in which he traced the development of architecture through various historical epochs leading up to constructivism. In Style and Epoch, Ginsburg argued that constructivist architecture was moving away, or had moved away, from the historicist and eclecticist styles of the 19th century and returned to a more constructive approach that had characterized the Gothic medieval period. So, as opposed to the styles of the 19th century, in which aesthetic features were conceived as autonomous from the tectonic form of a building and its functionality, for example, through ornament, constructivist architecture would attempt to reintegrate what Ginsburg referred to as the constructive and decorative aspects of architecture. And using the machine as an analogy, Ginsburg writes, quote, "In the machine, there are no elements that are disinterested from the standpoint of elemental aesthetics. There are no so-called free flights of fancy. Everything in it has a definite and clear-cut constructive task. That is why the machine, with its most actively functioning parts, with an absolute lack of non-working organs, quite naturally leads to an utter disregard of decorative elements, for which there is no more room, leads precisely to the idea of constructivism, so prevalent in our time, which must, by its very being, absorb the decorative, its antithesis," end quote. Ginsburg believed that in constructivist architecture, similarly to modern industrial machinery, there should be no disinterested, non-working elements. A disinterested element of a machine would be autonomous from its overall function. And in the kind of machine that Ginsburg had in mind, there are no disinterested elements, but each element is a working element. 15 years after Tatlin exhibited corner counterrelief, Ginsburg, together with his student from the Fultamas, Ignati Mininis, designed the Narkomfin for employees of the People's Commissariat for Finance of the RSFSR. The project originally included 4 buildings, of which 3 were built: a residential block, a communal block rotated 90 degrees in relation to the residential block and connected via a covered bridge. And we can see the covered bridge on the bottom right of the image on the left of the communal block, and then in the bottom left of the image on the right of the residential block, as well as a laundry pavilion at the opposite end of the site, which I won't show today. The residential block originally contained 43 apartments belonging to 2 types. K and F units, stacked in three vertical rows, in which the second and third rows of F units are sectionally inverted, which I'll show later. On both ends of the residential block, so the northern and southern ends, stairwells link to corridors on the first level, which projects into a balcony facing the park on the building's eastern elevation, and the fourth level. And on the roof, the Commissar for Finance of the RSFSR and sponsor of the project, Nikolai Milyutin, had his own penthouse built. And here are plans of the K and F units in the residential block. We'll look more in detail at the different apartment types, and I'll show a section and photographs in the next slides. But on the bottom, we can see the plans of the K units, which are 2 levels in height. The plan on the bottom left shows the first level public balcony and the first level of the K units, which inhabitants would enter through the corridor between the balcony and the K units. The entry would lead into a hallway that had stairs to the mezzanine level, as well as a kitchen or kitchen nook toward the back. And on the bottom right is a plan of the mezzanine of the K units, which extends over the corridor and balcony on the first level. And the mezzanine has a bathroom next to the top of the stairs and 2 separate bedrooms, one for parents and the other for children. On the top right is the 1.5 level F unit on the 5th and 6th levels. And on the top left is an inverted F unit on the 3rd level, so above the K unit mezzanine. And you can't see this now, but because of the sectional inversion, the height differentiation is registered in the ceiling rather than the floor, or registered in the ceiling of the 3rd level F units and on the floor of the 5th and 6th level inverted F units. And between the plan of the F units is a plan of the 4th level corridor through which inhabitants of the F units would enter their apartments. And Danilo told me from having visited the Narkomfin that the bathrooms were in the vestibule before inhabitants would either walk up or down into their respective units. The apartment types, so the K and F units, were developed by the building committee of the Russian Republic, or the Stroykom, which Ginsburg headed beginning in 1929. So the same types that had been developed could be recombined into a new building. So similarly to the objects that Tatlin combined in his corner counter-relief, Ginsburg and Minimis combined apartment types that had been developed at the Stroykom into the Narkomfin. Ginsburg envisioned the F units, so these at the top, as the standard apartment type for communal housing estates. The F units have the smallest square meterage. Originally, they lacked integrated kitchens and separate bathrooms. Inhabitants would be encouraged to use the communal block, which had a shared dining facility, as well as other communal spaces. The K units, by contrast, feature integrated kitchens and separate bedrooms, thereby maintaining the living arrangements of the traditional nuclear family, which was associated with bourgeois culture and its gendered divisions of domestic labor. And the aim was to, in the Narkomfin, was to transition inhabitants of the K units toward collective living arrangements. I also want to point out that the only spaces within the apartments where the pilotis, so the columns fully appear, are in the K units. Everywhere else, within the private spaces, columns are embedded in the infill walls. And this is a really important detail related to the transitional nature of the Narkomfin that I'll return to at the end. OSA members developed prototypes for collective housing under the Stroykom's aegis, or iterations of what they called the Dom Communa, communal house. The Dom Communa would function as a social condenser, which Ginsburg proposed in 1927 to be the paradigm of constructivist architecture, and that would realize the new content and the new form. In a social condenser, spaces are combined within a single building or grouping of buildings to stimulate collective encounters between inhabitants. Quote, like electrical condensers that transform the nature of current, as architect and historian Anatol Kopp wrote in his 1970 book, Town and Revolution, Soviet Architecture and City Planning, the social condenser would turn the self-centered individual of capitalist society into a whole person, the informed militant of socialist society, in which the interest of each merged with the interests of all, end quote. So the F units, as I mentioned, would become the standard apartment types in the Dom Communa that would promote collective living arrangements and turn the self-centered individual of capitalist society into a whole person. Looking at the section of the residential block, we can see the first level balcony and corridor, the K units split between the first and second levels, the fourth level corridor, and the two inverted F units split between the third and the fourth, fifth, and sixth levels. And I realize this section doesn't count the first level of the top row of F units as a separate level, but that's how Ginsburg designated the levels. Structurally, the residential block is supported by a 3x23 grid of pilotis that lift the building off the ground. And looking at the ground level, every other column in the middle row, or looking at the ground level from this image, every other column in the middle row is encased within a service core. And as I mentioned, the only spaces where the columns fully appear within the apartments in the residential block are in the K units. So they appear in the communal spaces of the residential block, including the ground level, the first level balcony, and fourth level corridor. And the buildings that you can see in the image on the right behind the residential block belong to the US Embassy compound. On the ground level, the pilotis were painted black to simulate the trees in the park that surrounded the residential block and that flowed underneath the building, and in order to establish a public social semantics on the ground level. So the pilotis relate to the trees and therefore the public space of the park. On the balcony and fourth level corridor, the pilotis were also painted black, thus extending the public social semantics of the park on the ground level through the residential block into the communal spaces. So the aesthetic presentation of the pilotis, rather than being disinterested, are thus working elements. The rhetorical deployment of the pilotis on the ground level in this way impinges on the most common agreed upon meaning of the pilotis as a structural type. And as we'll look at toward the end, the pilotis become estranged from their status as public signs within the private spaces of the residential block, which I alluded to when we looked at the plans of the K unit apartment type. Here we have one of the stairwells in the image on the left, and the second level corridor that accesses the K units and the balcony. And on the right, the double height living room of the K units in this image facing the residential block's western elevation. And there were 8 K units on the second level. As far as I know, the communal spaces of the residential block, so in the stairwells and corridors, have been painted back to their original colors after the restoration, whereas the apartment units have been whitewashed. They were originally painted according to different color schemes, which is what Alla Vronskaya writes about in the text that you all read for today. So in the left image, you can again see how color is being used as a working element. And according to Alla, inhabitants would expend minimal psychological energy in the perception of spatial volumes, which they would unconsciously register. So adjoining surfaces were painted in different hues, but not contrasting to the point that those surfaces would be perceived independently from the spatial volume that they articulate. In the right image, we can see that the pilotis protrude through the corner space of the K-unit living room between the intersection of the glazed surfaces facing the west elevation and the infill wall to the left of this image between the living room and the hallway space on the first level of the K units. After the renovation, the living rooms were retrofitted with kitchen appliances along the infill wall. And so I think the kitchen nook in the hallway space that we saw on the plan is now a second bathroom or storage space. And here you can see how the structural grid of the pilotis overlaps with the spatial layout of the K units rather than the pilotis being embedded in the infill wall. And I'll again return to this detail at the end. From the fourth level corridor, inhabitants of the F units would enter their living spaces through either one of two contiguous doors painted black or white, and either walk down into the F units on the third floor, directly above the mezzanine and double height living room of the K unit below, or they would walk up onto the fifth level of the F unit above. And the axonometric here is flipped in plan, but otherwise we get a good sense of the sectional differentiation between the two rows of F units. So the white painted doors that we see in the image on the left lead into the F units on the third level, so walking down, and the black painted doors lead into the F units on the fifth and sixth levels, walking up. And here you can see that the pilotis in the corridor are painted black. So again, extending the public social semantics from the ground level up through the residential block. The F units on the third level that we can see on the left are one and a half level in height, with a dropped ceiling in the bedroom space toward the eastern elevation, so in the background of this image. And they exhibit an open floor plan with the only enclosed spaces being storage closets toward the eastern elevation and the storage closet beneath the stairs, as well as the bathroom and the vestibule space, if that's where the bathrooms are, indeed. The F units on the fifth and sixth levels that we see on the image on the right, like the F units below, are one and a half level in height, but flipped in section. So inhabitants of the F units above would thereby experience the height differential on two separate levels, which the raised level, so the sixth level of the F units above, produces a separate bedroom space. And as I mentioned, the F units were originally designed with a kitchenette that inhabitants could use to make tea or reheat meals, which they would get from the shared dining facility in the communal block. So unlike the integrated kitchens that we see in these images following the restoration. And in the communal block, Ginsburg-Mininis combined different spaces and programs into a new semantic architectural series that aimed to realize the new content and the new form. And this included a dining facility, a gymnasium, and a library. The planned separate nursery, which was supposed to be the fourth building, was never constructed and ended up in the communal block. So again, like electrical condensers that transform the nature of current, as Kopp wrote, the Narkomfin would stimulate collective encounters between inhabitants by socializing domestic functions such as cooking and childcare. And we can see in the image on the right a restoration of the original interior color scheme within the communal block, in which again, color is used as a working element that allows inhabitants to unconsciously register the spatial volumes. Okay, so for the remainder of the presentation, I want to analyze the rhetorical deployment of the piloti within the K units. So we already saw that the piloti were painted black on the ground level and first level balcony to blend in with the surrounding trees, and to establish a public social semantics that extends through the residential block. But within the K units, the piloti were painted according to the interior color schemes. And unfortunately, I don't have photographs or diagrams of the K unit interiors that show their original color schemes. But the piloti in this way negotiate between public and private contexts within the residential block. So on the ground level, or sort of from the public sphere of the ground level, the semi-public sphere of the first level balcony and fourth level corridor, and the private sphere of the K unit interiors. So these spheres range between the urban environment, the residential blocks, communal spaces, and the individual apartments. Now, the repetition of piloti in public and private contexts manifests, and this is my reading, what Shklovsky described in artist technique as defamiliarization in psychological parallelism. Shklovsky writes that, quote, the perception of disharmony is important in parallelism. The purpose of parallelism is to transfer the usual perception of an object into the sphere of a new perception. That is, to make a unique semantic modification, end quote. So the appearance of the piloti within the K units disrupts their automatization as a public sign on the ground level and within the communal spaces of the residential block, transferring the usual perception of that object, which is already estranged from its most common agreed upon meaning as a structural type, into yet another sphere of new perception. So through the repetition of the same form in public and private contexts, the piloti gain what Shklovsky called or described as a much needed differential impression when he discussed triolet poetry in his 1925 essay, The Relationship Between Devices of Plot Construction and General Devices of Style. A triolet poem contains 8 lines, in which the first line repeats in the 4th and 7th lines, and the second line repeats in the 8th line. And as Shklovsky argued, through a landing of one and the same line of verse in different contexts, in which the same lines are sandwiched between different lines, repeated lines of verse gain a differential impression. So inhabitants' impressions of the piloti within the K units would be conditioned by their status as public signs in the residential and communal blocks. Conversely, in public contexts, the piloti would be conditioned by their status as private signs within the K units. Inhabitants would thereby perceive the piloti either as a public sign in a private context or as a private sign in a public context, psychologically transitioning inhabitants of the K units toward new modes of collective dwelling. In the essay that you read for today, which is from a monograph on the Narkomfin that Danilo edited, Bala demonstrates the influence of psychologism in the Narkomfin's design through an analysis of the polychromatic schemes that were applied to the walls in each of the apartments. She references Ginsburg, who described how the interior spaces or surfaces of the private spaces were painted with extremely little and noticeable spatial color shades of the same almost monochrome range. And as Bala writes, quote, the walls were given an invisible coloration, which was nevertheless perceived by the subject without consciously registering it. So color was used to rationalize and, in a sense, automatize the perception of space through its unconscious registration. The piloti within the K units were also painted according to the polychromatic schemes. However, the estrangement of the same form within the private spaces of the K units, a form that establishes a public social semantics in the communal spaces of the residential block and in the communal block, brings them back into the sphere of conscious perception. Inhabitants would thereby perceive their private spaces, and by extension themselves, as part of a collective. Ostranini, in this way, gives the illusion of a grammatical condition. the impression of the pilotis within the K units or communal spaces of the residential block and their association with either public or private context operates at the aesthetic level that gives the illusion of the presence of meaning. And yet, the grammatization of the aesthetics of the pilotis depends on the technique of their rhetorical deployment. So, to conclude, there is no what without a how, no content without form. Thank you all for your patience.